The night was cold, the kind that seeped through layers of clothing and made every breath visible in the air. Snowflakes drifted down lazily, coating the streets in a soft, white blanket. The city, usually bustling with noise, felt quieter, almost peaceful, except for the small shelter tucked between two aging brick buildings. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the rich, comforting scent of food being prepared. The hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clatter of pots and pans. It was Christmas Eve, and for many who had nowhere else to go, this place was more than just a shelter. It was a reminder that even in the hardest times, kindness still existed. Among the volunteers moving through the kitchen, carefully plating meals, was Daniel. He wasn't a professional chef, just a man who loved to cook. He had been volunteering here every Christmas Eve for the past few years. But something about this night felt different. Maybe it was the way the people in the shelter looked at him when he handed them their meals. Eyes filled with gratitude, some teary, some shy, but all silently thanking him in ways words couldn't. Maybe it was the way the elderly man at the end of the line squeezed his hand, murmuring a soft, "Bless you, son." Or maybe it was the young mother with two small children, hesitating before accepting her plate, as if unsure she deserved it. Daniel wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He wasn't someone whose name people would remember after that night. But in that moment, standing there in a small dimly lit kitchen, serving hot meals to people who had nowhere else to go, he felt something deeper than personal satisfaction. He felt connected. He felt that somehow, in some small way, he was making a difference. The shelter director, an older woman named Evelyn, watched him with quiet admiration. She had seen many volunteers come and go, some driven by the holiday spirit, some by guilt, and some, like Daniel, who simply cared. "You're a good man," she said softly, helping him stack empty trays. He just smiled and shook his head. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," he replied. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. If anyone would do it, there wouldn't be so many people out there still hungry. The night carried on with warmth and laughter, despite the chill. Outside, people ate, talked, and for a brief moment, forgot about their troubles. Even Daniel, usually private about his own struggles, found himself sitting at a table after the rush, chatting with a man who used to be a musician before life took a cruel turn. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The shelter doors would close for the night soon. Daniel wiped his hands on his apron, feeling the exhaustion settle in. He said his goodbyes, promising to return next year, and stepped outside into the icy night. His breath came out in soft clouds as he walked home, the streets nearly empty. Christmas lights twinkled in the windows of houses where families were gathered, sharing stories and opening gifts. He didn't expect anything in return for what he did. He never had. But when he got home, something was waiting for him on his doorstep. A package. There was no return address, no name, just a simple brown box sealed tightly. Daniel frowned, looking around. The street was deserted. His hands were stiff from the cold as he picked it up and carried it inside. Setting it down on the small wooden table in his kitchen, he hesitated for a moment before carefully peeling back the tape. Inside was something that would change everything. Daniel stared at the package, his fingers hovering over the flaps. And yes, strange feelings settled in his chest. Curiosity mixed with something heavier, something unexplainable. He hadn't been expecting anything. He lived a simple life, paycheck to paycheck, balancing his job at the diner with his passion for cooking. The only deliveries he usually got were bills, never something wrapped with care. Waiting on his doorstep in the dead of night, his heart pounded a little harder as he finally pulled the box open. Inside, Nestled beneath layers of tissue paper was an envelope and something even stranger, an old weathered cookbook. The pages were yellowed, edges curling, as if it had been used for years, passed down through generations. Daniel carefully lifted it out, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. It smelled faintly of spices, of warmth, of home. Frowning, he turned his attention to the envelope. His name was written on the front in neat handwriting, but nothing else. No sender, no clue as to who had left it. Swallowing, he tore it open and pulled out a letter. Daniel, you don't know me, but I know you. I saw what you did tonight. I've seen you every year, cooking for those who need it the most, giving them more than just food. You give them dignity. You remind them they matter. That's rare. These days, too many people walk by without noticing. But you see them. That's why this belongs to you now. It's more than just a book. It's a legacy. Inside, you'll find something that could change everything. If you're willing to take the next step. No signature. No explanation. Daniel reread the letter, his pulse quickening. This had to be some kind of joke. Or a mistake. But as he flipped through the pages of the cookbook, something strange happened. There were handwritten notes in the margins, small scribbles in faded ink. Some were recipes, others personal thoughts. And then he found it, a folded piece of paper, tucked between the pages like a secret waiting to be found. He unfolded it carefully, and his breath caught in his throat. An address. Nothing else, just a location, scrawled in the same neat handwriting as the letter. Daniel sat back, staring at the paper. A part of him told him to forget it, to go to bed, wake up in the morning, and pretend this never happened. But another part, stronger, louder, refused to ignore the feeling in his gut. Someone had gone through the trouble of leaving this for him. Someone had been watching, not in a sinister way, but in a way that suggested they had been waiting for the right moment to reach out, and now they had. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the address written on the paper. It led him to a small, unassuming cafe at the edge of town, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. The windows were slightly fogged from the warmth inside, and the scent of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the air as someone stepped out, holding a bag of pastries. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly, and the cozy interior welcomed him with the sound of quiet jazz playing in the background. There were only a handful of customers, and behind the counter stood an older man, wiping his hands on a towel. His face was familiar, though Daniel couldn't quite place where he had seen him before. The man looked up, his gaze locking onto Daniel's immediately, as if he had been expecting him. "You found it," the man said, setting the towel down. Daniel frowned. "Found what?" The man motioned toward the cookbook in Daniel's hands. "That book. It belonged to my father, and his father before him." Daniel glanced down at it, confused. "Why do I have it?" The man studied him for a moment, then sighed, as if deciding where to begin. "Because it was meant for someone like you. Someone who understands that food isn't just food. It's connection. It's history. It's healing." He nodded toward an empty seat. "Come on, let me tell you a story." Daniel sat, still unsure whether he had just stepped into something bigger than himself. As the man began to speak, the pieces started falling into place. The cookbook wasn't just a collection of recipes. It was a guide, a map to something more, and Daniel was about to learn that his act of kindness on Christmas Eve had set something in motion, something he never could have imagined. Daniel sat across from the older man, the worn cookbook resting on the table between them. The cafe smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls, and the soft murmur of voices created a peaceful hum in the background. But inside, Daniel felt anything but calm. His mind raced with questions, and he had no idea where this conversation was about. To lead, the man who introduced himself as Henry took a slow sip of his coffee before speaking. That book, it's not just a collection of recipes. It's a record of something bigger. My father started it when he was young. He used to cook for those in need, just like you do. Daniel's fingers traced the cracked leather cover. But why give it to me? Henry smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Because you're exactly the kind of person my father hoped would carry this forward. Someone who doesn't just cook for the sake of it, but someone who understands what food really means to people. It's not just about filling a plate. It's about making someone feel seen. Daniel absorbed his words. Something in his chest, tightening. He had always believed that cooking was more than just a skill. It was a way to connect, to show love, to give without expecting anything back. Henry continued, "My father left notes in that book. Places he visited, people he helped. He always believed that one day someone else would take his work further." He nodded toward Daniel. "And here you are." Daniel hesitated, flipping through the pages again. The handwritten notes, the small sketches of ingredients, the addresses, scribbled in the margins. It wasn't just a cookbook. It was a journey, one that had started long before him. "But what am I supposed to do with it?" he asked. Henry leaned back, studying him. "That's up to you. You can tuck it away and move on. Or you can use it, learn from it, and maybe, just maybe, change a few lives along the way." Daniel sat with that thought for a long time. He wasn't looking for something like this. He hadn't expected it, but deep down he knew. This wasn't just about the past. It was about what came next. The next few weeks were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He started reading the notes carefully, following the breadcrumbs left behind by Henry's father. Some led him to community kitchens, others to struggling restaurants that had once been places of warmth, but had fallen on hard times. Everywhere he went, he cooked. He met people who had stories written in the lines of their faces, people who had been forgotten, people who just needed one small reminder that they weren't invisible. And in doing so, something changed inside him. Cooking had always been his passion, but now it felt like something more, a purpose. One evening, he found himself back at the shelter where it all began. Evelyn greeted him with a warm smile, but her eyes widened when she saw what he carried under his arm. "The cookbook," she murmured, running a hand over the cover. "I remember this." Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "You knew about it?" She nodded. "I knew Henry's father. He used to cook here, long before you ever did." Her smile grew, soft and knowing. "I think you were meant to have it." Daniel glanced around the kitchen, at the familiar faces, at the people who had come to depend on this place as their refuge. He realized then that he didn't need to go searching for where he belonged. He had already found it. That Christmas Eve, he cooked again, but this time, something was different. He wasn't just feeding people. He was continuing something bigger than himself. He wasn't just a volunteer. He wasn't just a cook. He was part of a legacy. And as he handed a plate to an elderly man who smiled with quiet gratitude, Daniel knew this was only the beginning.